This morning is our third class and our last class on this topic, on the history of global Christian missions. This is the one that I liked all of them, but I really like this one. So I hope that you will too. This is moving into the modern era of Christian missions, and it's an extraordinary time from about 1800 forward. Just to briefly review, though, what we talked about last week. Last week we looked at the Middle Ages of Christian missions, about the year 500 to the year 1800. And we saw a couple interesting things. We saw that during the Middle Ages, when Christianity was expanding into Europe and East, one of the big factors that contributed to the success or failure of missionary penetration into a new culture, a new country, was whether they could get the favor of the local chieftain or the local king. And we saw that when they could do that, they could then establish a base of operations, a beachhead, a monastery of some sort, and then they would start spreading the gospel. However, there was a risk associated with that. Because these missionaries were relying on what today we would call state sponsorship, whenever there would be a transition in authority, whenever there would be a new chieftain, they would risk backlash because they were so associated with the former prince or the former tribal chief, that if a new guy came in who didn't like the old guy, then they might get martyred. And this happened back and forth. Another thing that was interesting about that period was the very fact that monasteries became a vehicle for Christian missions. Remember, we talked about this last week, that originally the monastic tradition in Christianity was meant to be an escape from the world, but in the Middle Ages it actually became a vehicle for sending missions to the world. Very interesting the way the Lord turned that around. We also saw that during the Reformation era, in general, the Protestant churches were not as active in global missions as the Roman Catholic churches. Now, does anybody remember some of the reasons why that was? There were a couple just kind of baseline logistic reasons. Jeremy? Yeah, right. So one of the big reasons was all the Protestant countries were landlocked. They didn't have these massive navies. And so the big seafaring empires of the time, Portugal and Spain, were Roman Catholic. So they have a logistical leg up. Another factor had to do with monasteries, right? Were Protestants favorable toward monastic orders? Not at all. But in an era where the monastic orders were the vehicle for missions, if you get rid of the monastic orders, even for good reasons, what have you also gotten rid of is your primary sending structure. And so it's really not till the modern era, what we're going to talk about today, that the Protestants started developing their own missionary sending agencies. We have some more handouts now. Who needs one? Couple up here. Thank you, Ryan. Now, all of that said, that doesn't mean that the Protestants were inactive. We also talked about two things that the Protestants were very keen on during the Reformation era. What were those things? Anybody remember? Logan? Bible translation into the vernacular. And then there was one other. Put it this way, was Protestantism unzealous for the gospel? Of course not, right? So where was their focus? Training pastors and bringing the gospel back to the church that already was, right? So there's a sense in which you can say for Protestants, their mission was to the established church. Okay, so it's not that they were completely inactive, they just had a different focus. Now, that's where we were. But as we get to today, we're going to see that all of that changes. All of that changes in really, really cool ways. It's a big period of time, and even though I say 1800 to the present, we're really not going to get past the beginning of the 20th century. We just can't, sorry. Maybe in future years. But I want to start like we did last week by going over just a timeline of some key events that'll give you a picture, a snapshot of what was happening during this period. So if you got your handout, this is on the front. In terms of the modern era of missions, it really begins in the year 1792. 1792, a hitherto unknown person named William Carey, a small little Baptist pastor from nowhere in England, publishes a book. And by the way, this is the era before there were editors. And so you could make your title as long as you want. And a lot of these old books have really long titles, and his book is one of those books. His book was titled, An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. Can you say that 5 times fast? That was the title. He publishes that book, and in that book, there is all this data, all of these charts, all these statistics. We're going to talk about this book a little bit later on. But the burden of that book was that Protestant churches need to stand up and go and take the gospel to the nations. Now, today, in our day, is there really anything controversial about that idea? Not really, not in our culture at least, right? But in his day, it was controversial, and we'll talk about why that was. But that book, the publication of that book in 1792 is, by most people, would be considered the beginning of the modern era, particularly of Protestant foreign missions. That same year, William Carey helps form one of the very first Protestant missionary societies, the Baptist Missionary Society in England. The next year, William Carey and his family volunteer, and they go to India as one of the very first missionary families sent by the Baptist Missionary Society. So he is the beginning. 2 years after he goes to India, you have the London Missionary Society, which is established. And this was established by, also in Britain, no surprise, right, London. But this was established not by Baptist churches, but by congregational churches. What is a congregational church? Does anybody know? Ryan, what's a congregational church?
Ruled by the congregation, so all decisions must be voted on and agreed to by a majority.
Kind of, yeah. Like in the old way, that's how we would understand a congregational church today. Yeah, but in this period of time, these churches may or may not have had elders. They might have at a local level, they may have looked pretty Presbyterian. They would still baptize infants. That's going to be an important thing to remember later. But they didn't have presbyteries. There was no connection with other churches, and so they were congregational in that sense. But they might actually have elders. They might look a lot like a Presbyterian church today, except no presbytery. But they did practice infant baptism, and that's why they were not part of the Baptist associations, right? So there's now 2 missionary societies. 4 years later, the Church of England gets in on the act and forms the Church Missionary Society. So are you seeing how it's like dominoes being pushed down, right? It's the Baptist organization that gets things started, then the congregationals start listening and praying, then the evangelicals in the Church of England start paying attention. 1807, Robert Morrison, the very first Protestant missionary to China, arrives in China. We'll talk about him a little bit later. A couple years later, now in North America, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, also a congregationalist body, is founded, and they become known by the acronym ABCFM. You think of it with a little more ingenuity, they maybe could have been ABCDEF, but they didn't do that. ABCFM, one of the very first American missionary societies. And then a couple years later, Adoniram Judson is sent initially by the ABCFM to the Far East. Hopefully, many of you have heard of these names. How many know the names Carey, Morrison, and Adoniram Judson, or at least one of those 3? All right, so these are well-known persons. A year later, then the American Baptists formed their missionary board. And then a little bit later, about a dozen years later, Church of England bishop in India, Calcutta is in India, Reginald Heber composes the hymn, Holy, 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 as a means of contrasting the biblical God with the Hindu gods. Now, how many of you knew that we've all sang that song, right? We're going to sing it again this morning, spoiler alert. But how many of you knew that that song was motivated by a desire, by a missionary impulse? Think about it. I'm going to read to you just a couple lines from this hymn. And now think about it in that vein. When he says, Holy, 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 though the darkness hide thee, though the eye of sinful man thy glory may not see. Think about that line being written in India. Do they have statues of the gods in India? All over the place. And so this hymn is not just worshiping the true God, but it is teaching, it is contrasting with the Hindu gods. Here's another line from verse 3. Only thou art holy, there is none beside thee. Again, true biblical truth, but also in a polytheistic context, that would have been a missionary, a teaching line. Perfect in power and love and purity. Again, the holiness of God, the perfection and the moral character of God in contrast with the chaos of polytheism. And there's more. As we sing that hymn later this morning in our worship, I encourage you to think about it in that context. It was written in a missionary context. A little bit later on, then the North American Presbyterians formed their Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. That's 1837. A little bit later, Hudson Taylor goes to China. Hudson Taylor is an early missionary to China, but he's kind of a second generation missionary. Very influential, very important, but second generation. And then a couple years later, John Peyton goes to the New Hebrides. And then toward the end of that time period, Hudson Taylor forms the China Inland Mission. So that is a snapshot of a period of time of just over 150 years. Not even 100 years. It's early. You can see how much the Lord stirred up the Protestant church to really get involved with global missions. And in fact, I give you this statistic right under the timeline. This is really astonishing. From the establishment of the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792 until 1960, 80% of Protestant missionaries to the world have been from English-speaking nations. Isn't that something? Go ahead, Trina. So that's a great question. So the question was, for those of you on the live stream, we know more about English-speaking history because we're English-speaking people. What about other nations, especially other Protestant nations? There was some missionary activity from non-English-speaking nations. I think maybe briefly mentioned it last week. Calvin was sending people back into France. The Moravians were sending missionaries around the world. But the resources that I've been using, Trina, have intentionally tried to have a more global focus. And both of those resources are the ones that cite this statistic. And so it really wasn't until William Carey got things started. I mean, nowadays there are missionaries from a lot of Protestant missionaries from all over the world. Right? South Korea sends missionaries all over the world. When we were overseas, we knew people from Holland, from Australia. I guess Australia is English-speaking, depending on how you determine what English is. I'm teasing, if any of you are watching. But yeah, by and large, it really was the English-speaking world that got Protestant missions going again. So the rest of the class today is going to be, again, there's just so much information. We can't possibly tell you everything that happened during this period. So what I did for this last lesson is I picked out 5 of these key people, and I'm going to give you a little, just quick kind of snapshot of their life and ministry as a way of giving you a snapshot and a picture of the modern era of Protestant missions. And what you're going to see, I think, as we look at each of these figures, is there are certain recurring themes that occur and sort of gives you a good sense of what Protestant missions look like. Joff, are you looking for a handout? Oh, okay, sorry. If you need to close those doors, you can. Okay, so the first person we're going to look at this morning is William Carey. William Carey is considered by many to be the father of modern missions, but he was not brought up to be a missionary. William Carey came from just a regular working class family. He was eventually apprenticed as a shoemaker, which in those days were called cobblers. That is a way cooler name for a shoemaker, isn't it? A cobbler. And really, for the rest of his life, he often identified himself as a cobbler, even once he had moved well beyond shoemaking. But he was a shoemaker until the age of 28. Never attended university, never went to college. Just didn't come from money, did not come from privilege. Very blue collar, very working class, probably like many of us grew up. But nevertheless, despite the fact that he never had that access to sort of the higher corridors of education, William Carey, either by himself or with friends, managed to learn Greek, managed to learn Hebrew, and just studied a wide variety of subjects. One of his most famous sayings, not the most famous, but one that I really like. I used to have this hanging over the wall in my office in Pennsylvania. Carey said, if you want to know why I'm successful, he said, here's my secret. I can plod. What does plod mean? Just means put one foot in front of the other, right? Slowly going forward. He says, I can plod. I can persevere in any definite pursuit. So give me a goal, and I can walk toward it. However slowly, however long it takes, I can get there. He says, to this I owe everything. And we're going to see that simple ability to just persevere, that long, what we today would call long obedience in the same direction, that ability to plod and persevere made him, in the hands of God, a very, very successful missionary and missiologist. The next point on your outline is really a thing that was catalytic for him was that he had gotten a hold, one of the books that he read, he's reading all the time, one of the books he got a hold of was The Voyages of Captain James Cook. Captain James Cook was an English explorer, naval captain, and he sailed all over the world and into places that had hitherto been unknown by the British, and he kept a journal, and he published this book called The Voyages. And as he read that, I give you the quote right there on their handout, Carey's vision for the spiritual needs of the world caught fire. It's enamored with data, stories, and maps. He would even place maps of the world in his shop, which guided him into prayer and into deeper study. And if you ever get a chance to read about Carey, one of the images from his early years was just of this man in his cobbler's shop, furiously working on shoes, but also always having a book open in front of him, having these maps on the walls, and so that he's thinking, he's praying, he's learning, even as he's working. And, most of us know this, but especially in this sort of pre-industrial time, the kind of work that they did was pretty hard work, right? There wasn't like an hourly wage. If you didn't finish the set of shoes, you didn't get paid. And so, this man is working really hard, but also studying really hard. Just that desire to plod and to work hard for the Lord Jesus. He's really a great example to all of us. He was a Baptist by conviction. He was a Calvinistic Baptist, though. So he believed in the sovereignty of God and salvation, that man is totally depraved, that God elects and God must call us and give us faith. And so when he publishes his book, an inquiry into the obligations of Christians, etc., he actually hits a lot of backlash. And it's sad to say, but many in his Calvinistic Baptist fellowship in those days were what we would today call hyper-Calvinists. They were hyper-Calvinists because they said, look, you believe that God is the one who gives people faith? You believe that God is the one who chooses who will live? Well then, why pray? Why evangelize? God will do it in his time, in his way. That's sort of a hyper-Calvinistic approach. It's not what we believe. It's not what Calvin believed. And it is not what Carey believed. And William Carey, the whole thrust of his book and the whole thrust of his ministry was, yes, God is sovereign, and yes, God sends the church. How will God sovereignly call the nations? It is by him sending out the church into the world, and the church is the means by which God will sovereignly call his people to himself, and not in the future, now. So Carey was basically just saying, yes, believe in the sovereignty of God and salvation. That's biblical. Ephesians 1, Ephesians 2, Romans 8, of course. But also believe in the Great Commission, Matthew 28. We are the ones who are sent to go. Again, today we take this for granted. This is what we believe, but it was a hard sell for his church and his association back then. But he was relentless. Again, this man plods, right? So he gets pushed back. What does he do? He keeps walking forward. They push him back again. What does he do? He keeps walking forward. And so he keeps agitating in a godly way for the cause of Protestants to take up the gospel banner, to take the cross to the nations. Later that year, he is elected to preach at an association meeting for Baptist ministers, and he preaches a sermon about the need for the church to be God's missionary agents to the world. And it is in the course of that sermon that he utters his most famous saying, which many of us have heard and still use today: believe great things, or expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. How many of you have heard that before? Yeah, very famous. It was from that sermon in 1792. And through his persistency, through his plodding, through his gentle but firm agitation, that same year, a number of Baptist ministers get together and form the Baptist Missionary Association. Now, sounds great, right? Now we've got a missionary association. Problem is, now we need missionaries. And then, as now, it's not easy to recruit missionaries. Many of you have heard, through our prayer requests here at Covenant, that even today, our denomination, the OPC, actually is having a lot of trouble recruiting missionaries. This is a difficult time for us, and I'm on the missions board for our denomination. We're having trouble recruiting people who are willing to go abroad for the gospel. Even though we're committed to it in principle, even though we may be committed to it in our head, it's another thing for that to actually trickle down to our hearts. It's a hard sell for many. Then as now, it's a hard sell to leave your home culture, to leave the environment where you at least know how things go, you feel a certain level of control, and throw yourself into a foreign context where, trust me, you feel very little sense of control. So Carey and his associates formed the Baptist Missionary Association, but then they start having trouble finding missionaries. And so Carey, being a man of conviction, a man of integrity, said, if nobody else will volunteer, I will volunteer. And so he and his family go. They go the next year, 1793, they go to India. And one of the things, if you ever get a chance to read a book about William Carey, you'll learn right away is that it was really, really hard for their family. They were facing a lot of official hostility, even though India by that point was kind of sort of under the control of Great Britain. It was controlled by an organization called the East India Company. How many of you have read about them in history? The East India Company initially was quite hostile to missionary labors in India. They didn't want, even though they were from England, from an ostensibly Protestant nation, they did not want missionaries working in India. And so Carey kind of has to go under the radar. Eventually he has to relocate to an area of India that's not controlled by the East India Company. So he basically has to run from his own countrymen. But besides that, when he gets there, he doesn't have any real, financial support base. So he starts working works as an indigo planter. And so he basically establishes an indigo plantation. They have a child who died. The Careys had a child who died, and in the aftermath of that, Mrs. Carey, his wife, his first wife, just had a mental and nervous breakdown, a mental health crisis, and she never really recovered. So there was a lot of suffering. Yes, Betty? Well, I know, I hear what you're saying. I think, just remember, these are the first ones, right? This is the first time there's ever been really an organized, English-speaking Protestant missionary society. And even if they want to send money, I mean, it's a long boat ride, right? There's no wiring of funds. So I think it was just very, very difficult. I can't remember all the details. I believe they raise some money before they go, but, people that go overseas, you find out pretty quick that initial amount that you set aside to set things up usually runs short. I don't think it was malice. I think it was just people are still trying to figure this out. Joffrey, you had a question?
Yeah, in his lifetime, Charles Darwin came with the evolution kind of theory.
Right, Darwin was contemporary to this period, I think, yes.
Yeah, and I wonder how was his approach to that, because he decided to leave England and go to India when things were happening there in Europe. This kind of movement was
Yeah.
like a small thing.
So I'm not, what's the question that you're asking, Joffrey? I'm sorry. You're just talking about the interaction of like Darwin's thinking at this time as well?
Yeah, well, basically, what drives the important person, because he seems to be an important person at that point.
Oh, I see, yeah. So,
Drove him to go to India instead of trying to keep.
yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. So if I understand your question correctly, Joffrey is asking, You know, whenever there was enough, basically the church in England had enough problems already. Why then did he leave England and go overseas whenever there was plenty of ministry to do in his own country? And brother, I just have to tell you that question is always asked, even to this day. It doesn't matter how long ago. Any place where the church is established anywhere in the world, there's always trouble. And when we were thinking, you know, some years ago, when we were thinking of going overseas, people in our congregation asked the exact same question. Well, isn't there plenty of ministry to do here? And I think for us at that time and for William, I don't know what Carey would have said to that exact question, but if I'm in any way resonant with his spirit, I think the answer would have been, yes, but the gospel is much more available here. There is much more a supply of gospel ministry here than there is there. And I think Carey would have said he was most needed in India and not in England. That's my guess, but I'm honestly not sure. But it's a great question, and it comes up all the time in missionary circles. Go ahead, Chuck.
One of the things in the Methodist church I came from, is they had a very focused missionary to Africa.
Uh-huh.
And now the African missionaries are coming back
Mm-hmm.
to America and saying, hey, we need to get your Africa.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
That's
Yeah.
a good thing when somebody from forward
Right.
comes back.
Right, so for those of you listening on the live stream, Chuck was just pointing out that, you know, for years and years, the North American Methodists sent missionaries to Africa, and now the African Methodists are sending missionaries back to the United States, trying to call the American Methodists back to the gospel. Praise God for that, right? Beth, did you have a comment? Yeah. I'll bring that up. Okay, yeah. So there's a great little anecdote about John Payton. It's not on the handout, but I will remember to bring it up now. So Carey goes to India, and things are really, really hard for their family. Eventually, the Careys decide to leave East India Company territory, and they team up with two other families, and they move to a Dutch area of India. And of course, Holland was a Protestant nation. They had a little more patronage there. And so they end up in an area called Serampore. And so Carey and a guy named Marshman, and there's one other, I think his name might have been Williams. There's the Serampore trio. And these three families work together, and that's where they're based. Their mission is based for basically the next 30 years till Dr. Carey dies. I call him Dr. Carey. I think he might have been given an honorary doctorate later. But what did they do? What were the 5 emphases of their ministry in India? These are all in the bullets there at the bottom of the page. One of their big emphases was Bible translation. Remember we talked about this was the thing that Protestantism sort of put back in the DNA of the global church in terms of missions. Well, the Serampore trio were phenomenal at Bible translation. Look at this statistic. Over the next 30 years, the Serampore team contributed to the work of Bible translation in 39 Indian languages. 39. 30 years, 39 languages. Have any of you ever tried to learn a foreign language? It's not easy. But again, just that plodding, that persevering, that willingness to work hard. 6 translations of the whole Bible. This is how the stats break down. Of those 39, 6 translations of the whole Bible. 23 complete New Testaments in addition to those other 6. And then portions of the Bible in 10 other languages. And Carey himself, the man who never went to college, was personally responsible for bringing the Bible into Bengali, into Sanskrit. Sorry, there's a typo. I think the page says Sanskrit. It's Sanskrit. And Marathi. The cobbler from nowhere, the cobbler from the backside of nowhere translates the Bible single-handedly into 3 foreign languages. So let me just tell you, this is a point of application, even though it's not a sermon. Kids, young people, don't let anybody ever tell you you couldn't serve in missions because you don't have the background for it. That is hogwash. Carey did it, you could do it too. In fact, even today, Carey is held by experts as being sort of the founder of prose literature in the Bengali language. It's interesting. He had an aptitude for languages, and he was just good at studying languages. He worked hard at it. And even though later on, as the Bible translation in Bengali continues to be developed. Later on, they found a lot of issues with this translation. You know, the current, my understanding is that the modern best translations of the Bible in Bengali don't really rely too much on Carey's work. They said, well, there were a lot of issues with it. Nevertheless, he gave them something, right? He gave them a Bible, whereas before they had no Bible. So it's still phenomenal. Another thing they did, again, another real important advance in terms of missiology, is they realized if you're going to go spread the gospel, you need to have a church to bring people into when they're converted. So once the Serampore Trio got set up, they automatically organized their families as a church. So that as they were sharing the gospel with Indian people and they were becoming saved, then they had a church they could join. They never made this distinction between Christianity and the church. They always go together. The gospel of Christ brings people into the body of Christ, and they were very keen on emphasizing that. They were keen on evangelism and preaching. The Serampore, I call them M's here in quotes. So if you're ever overseas and you're in an area where it's gospel ministry is restricted, missionaries won't use the word missionary. That's a dangerous word, so they'll say M's. Not M&M's, M's. So the Serampore M's conducted preaching tours. They established new churches. They were also very keen on the idea of what we today call contextualization, meaning they understood that if you were really going to see the gospel take root in the hearts and culture of India, then those who were ministering the gospel needed to understand how the hearts and minds and culture of India worked. Not so that the gospel could be watered down, but so that it could be targeted, so that the message could be targeted well. They were keen on that. They took a little bit of flack for that, but they said, no, it's important for us to understand how Indians think so that we know how best to minister the gospel to them. And finally, they were very keen on training indigenous leaders. So before the end of that 30 years, they had set up a training college so that Indian Christians could be educated in, general arts and sciences, but also training for the ministry. And so you see these main emphases that you're going to see over and over again. Some of them begin with Carey and the Serampore Trio. Let's keep going. Let's flip over to the back. The next man I'd like to tell you about a little bit today is Robert Morrison. And trust me, I could give you a lot more than 5 bullets on the life of Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison was the first Protestant missionary sent to China through the London Missionary Society. But for a while, when he first got to China, he really had to stay off the official radar. First of all, foreigners weren't allowed to live on mainland China, period, really with almost no exceptions. And again, he's going at a time when who is controlling English-speaking trade in East Asia? It's the East India Company. The East India Company doesn't want missionaries there. So Morrison is intent to go there. He's intent to be a missionary. He's already got 2 strikes against him from his own country. The 3rd strike against him, seemingly, is that it was illegal for Chinese subjects to teach their Chinese language to a foreigner. In fact, it was a capital offense in the Chinese Empire at that time. If you were a Chinese person and you got caught teaching your language to a foreigner, they would just kill you. Nevertheless, you'd have to read a biography of him to figure out how he did it. But Robert Morrison managed to learn Chinese language in secrecy. And as he was learning, again, this guy is just meticulous. Like William Carey, he can plod. And so as he's learning each word, he's writing it down. He's writing down the characters. He's writing down the meaning. He's figuring out how it would be pronounced using English letters. And over the course of his labors, he amasses a massive amount of data on the Chinese language. By 1809, so this is only, remember, this is 2 years later, less than 2 years later, his Chinese is good enough that the East India Company decides to hire him as a translator. Isn't that cool? I don't think he told them, well, I'm really here as a missionary. But he gets hired by the East India Company as a translator for official documents. Now, what does that do for him? First of all, it gives him some official legal cover. Second of all, it gives him financial support. And now he's got a reason to be working with Chinese-speaking people. Right now, he's got what today would be called in many closed countries a visa job. He's got cover. And so he continues his work. And over the course of his ministry, there were only 11, he and his future partner, his associate in missions, William Milne, they only ever saw about 11 converts during their time. One of those, though, became the first Chinese Protestant pastor ever. They ordained him later, so that's cool. But although they didn't see a great amount of fruit in terms of quantity, in terms of numbers, their greatest work in missions for China was, again, translation, language labors. Robert Morrison, over the course of those years studying the Chinese language, remember I told you he's writing everything down, he's making notes, he amasses enough information that he is the one who publishes the very first Chinese-English dictionary, like ever. And that is no small task, because if you're going to teach English-speaking people Chinese, you not only have to teach them to recognize the pictogrammatic characters, but each of those characters also has a pronunciation. And if you've ever looked at Chinese language, you know that just looking at the character doesn't usually tell you how to pronounce it. And so for each word you're going to learn, you have to learn the pictogram and you have to learn the sound. But if Chinese is only written in pictograms, how do you write the sounds? So Morrison had to pioneer a way of transliterating Chinese sounds into English. I'm already giving you too much information. People are covering their faces. It's complicated, but the point is he did it. He did it, and his work was then used by generations, not just of missionaries, but just of people trying to bridge the gap between East and West. Another thing that was very important with Morrison is he was the first person to provide a complete translation of the Bible into Chinese. He didn't translate all of it from scratch himself. The historical records are a little murky, but certain portions of the Bible had been translated into Chinese prior to Morrison. I think part of the story with him is that, like, in the British Library, somehow there was at least a rough translation of the Gospels that somebody had made that ended up there. So, I mean, he started with some fragments, but it was Morrison and his team that really put together and finished the complete Bible in Chinese, and then figured out how to print it, which, again, they're not legally allowed to do this, right? So these guys are pretty clever. Eventually, though, they were up against a hard wall, and that hard wall was the fact that foreigners are not allowed to live in China. And so he and his associates decided, well, if we can't reach the Chinese in China, we will seek to reach the Chinese outside of China. And so they relocated to a place called Malacca, which is in modern-day Malaysia, and they established a training college there to labor among the Chinese diaspora. So Chinese people living outside of China, there were plenty of them in Malaysia. So they said, let's set up in Malaysia. We can minister openly here, we can print the Bibles here, we can equip Chinese people here who can then return freely into the empire. Brothers and sisters, this is a big advance in terms of missiology. This is still what happens today for students from all over the world, from closed countries. Why do you think there is such a focus on international ministries at major universities, even today here in North America? Because there are places in the world where we can't go to, but those same places will send the nations to our doorstep. And so international ministries, whether here in Dayton, over in Columbus, other major cities, it's a very important part of reaching the world for Christ. And these guys are the ones that are like figuring all this out. They're pioneering this ministry. We've only got about 15 minutes. I want to keep going. I want to get through all the others. Adoniram Judson. Now, so Morrison and Carey are from Great Britain. Adoniram Judson is an American. His missionary career gets off to a little bit of a rocky start. Why? Because he is sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM, and they are what denominational affiliation? Congregationalists, right? Paedo-Baptists. He is sent over to India, and while he's on the boat, he starts thinking, the first people I'm going to touch base with when I get to India are William Carey and the Serampore Trio. And those guys are all Baptists. So I better brush up on my Baptist theology just so I know how to interact with them. I want to have good conversations. I want to be a good brother. And even if we disagree, I want to be able to disagree well. I want to charitably understand their position. So on the boat, he starts studying Baptist distinctives. Today what we would call the argument between credo baptism and paedo baptism, right? Here's the thing. He becomes convinced of the credo Baptist position. So he left America as a paedo Baptist. He lands in India as a Baptist. And so what's he going to do? He was sent by a missionary organization that was intending to send Congregationalists, Paedo-Baptists, Adoniram Judson was a man of integrity, and so he resigned. He wrote back to the American board and said, well, guys, I've had a change of conviction on this issue. I totally understand that's not what you sent me out as. It's no problem. I love you. I'm resigning. And then you'll look back on your timeline. A year after Adoniram Judson goes to Burma, what new missionary board is formed? The American Baptist Missionary Board. So how about that? So he ends up going to India first, touches base with the guys in Serampore, but ultimately ends up in Burma, which is modern-day Myanmar. And when he arrives in Burma, again, no language background, doesn't know the language, they don't have any support structure there, so he and his wife, again, they just start working hard. They launch themselves into language studies. They're dealing with the conditions of life in this country. As his language progresses, and Judson was another one of these guys that was just a dogged, hard worker. Eventually, he became an acknowledged master of the Burmese language. I think his Bible translation went through like 8 editions during his lifetime or something like that. It's a crazy amount of work. As his language progresses, they decide that they are going to build something called a zayat. Have you ever seen a picture of a Burmese zayat? You should look it up sometime. You look it up on Wikipedia. It's sort of this very fancy, sort of ornamental, Eastern-looking pavilion with kind of the fancy kind of curved roofs and big open porch area. And the idea was this was a way that in Burmese society, this is where people would meet to just have tea, to talk, to have conversations. This is where teachers would meet with their students. And so he says, well, I'm going to build a zayat. That's how people go to meet one another. That's how people learn about things. I'm going to do one, and I'm going to use it as a missionary zayat. And so he builds a zayat for people to meet and talk, for him to teach. It ultimately is a place where he conducts worship. And things are progressing. Eventually they have some success. People are coming to Christ. However, in 1824, so about roughly 10 years after they get there, war breaks out between Burma and the British Empire. And that's a huge problem for Judson. Why? You say, well, he's not a British subject. He's an American citizen. Don't they know the difference? Yes and no. The reality is, Burma is at war with a group of foreigners who speak English. And now comes along this guy preaching foreign religions, who is a foreigner, and he speaks English. So the Burmese government treated him the way many governments in closed countries today still treat foreign missionaries. They treat him as a spy, and they lock him up. And he is in jail for about 2 years, basically for the entire duration of the war. And again, this is like an Apostle Paul style jail. These are squalid jails, very dangerous. There's no like three square meals a day, warm, dry bed, clean clothes. Nothing like that. Nothing like an American prison. The only way he survives is by his wife, Ann Judson, basically moving into a shack just outside the walls of the prison and constantly agitating to be allowed to bring him food, to be allowed to care for him. I think this has been a while since I read the book. This is the book where all this is, by the way. It's in your church library, as Pastor Patton would remind you. There's even a part of the story where she smuggles in, or maybe she didn't smuggle in, or he had with him parts of his Bible translation manuscript, and they basically hide it in a pillow inside this kind of coarse straw sack pillow to protect the Bible translation, and she kind of gets it out and protects it. But it's just terrible conditions. Finally, after 2 years, the war ends, he's released, and Mrs. Judson dies. Dies of smallpox. But again, you're seeing a pattern, right? These are hard conditions. In fact, a friend of mine one time said, the history of missions is littered with the graves of missionary wives. And it's so true, and you see it in these early stories. Judson does eventually remarry, and he continues to work in Burma for the rest of his career, for the rest of his life. By 1834, so again, about 10 years further on, he completely translated the Bible into Burmese. And by the time of his death in 1850, he again, like Morrison, had put together enough material that they were able to start working on a Burmese English dictionary. So that's Adoniram Judson, very, very hardworking, determined guy. Another guy who's also worth reading about, and we've only got 5 minutes, I've got to really hurry. John Paton. John Paton was a Scotsman, and his career was also anything but smooth. So Beth mentioned this earlier. I have to share this anecdote, not on your handout. Paton's early career, when he wanted to be a missionary from very young. But he realized, to be a missionary, he's got to have some training, not just in theology, but he's going to be going to like some far-off corner of the world. He also needs to learn about medicine and just a lot of things about ministry. So he goes, is it to Glasgow? I think he's in Glasgow, and he's studying medicine, and he's working for a church. And part of the way the church was supporting him is they were supporting him as what they call a parish visitor. So somebody that goes around into just the slums of Glasgow and brings the gospel and ministers to people. And it turns out he just had a gift for this. And so his ministry in Glasgow was just really, really successful. People were getting converted. Groups were being organized for Bible study. And by the time he's getting ready to leave to go to the New Hebrides, the South Seas, people are asking him, like, why are you doing this? There's so much good ministry to do here. And his response is the same. Well, but they don't have the gospel at all there. Somebody says to him at one point, but Paton, you'll be eaten by cannibals. And he says, and you'll be eaten by worms. What does it matter? We're all going to eventually die. We have an obligation to serve the Lord. And so I've already tipped my hat a little bit. He and his wife, they go to what were then called the New Hebrides, today the nation of Vanuatu. And they get there, and within about 3 months after their arrival, Mrs. Paton gives birth to their first child. A month later, both her and the child die. Again, this is just the suffering that they encountered as early missionaries. Not only did she die, but the people of the New Hebrides were cannibals. They would fight one another, and whenever their tribes fought, whoever won took the bodies, roasted them, and they had a feast. Really. They threatened missionaries. Some of the early missionaries that had attempted to get onto these islands were basically murdered and eaten. And so he works under the most terrifying circumstances you can imagine for years, for several years. He does see some early fruit. His life is threatened in violent ways so many times. If you read the story of Paton, you just lose track of how many times there's like a hatchet being swung at his head, and he's holding the guy's arm back from beheading him and saying, Jesus loves you, and by the way, if you do this, God's going to be really mad. That happened so many times. There were times when there was a group of people coming to kill him. He can see them coming, and then they just all of a sudden stop and go away. Just miraculous supernatural deliverance. Eventually, though, things come to a terrible head. I think they were British, maybe American, I'm not sure. English-speaking traders land on the island to trade for something called sandalwood, very precious commodity. But one of the things that the sandalwood traders would do is that they would bring blankets with smallpox in them to kill off the natives, to reduce the population so that they had less trouble whenever they came. So that the native people, many of them are dying of smallpox, and guess who they blame? Well, the guys who sailed away, they're in trouble, but guess who else is from that same culture who's living on their island? Oh, Missy Paton. And so there comes a point where he's basically chased to the very extremity of life and eventually has to evacuate. So he evacuates and spends about 4 years in Australia and then back in Britain trying to just raise awareness, raise support. When he goes back, he gets remarried. When he goes back to the New Hebrides a couple years later, he goes back to a different island, an island called Aniwa. People there are the same, cannibals, pagans, but now God does something very different. And through their ministry, you have to read the story, it's just so amazing. By the end of their ministry, essentially the entire island of Aniwa has professed faith in Christ. It's just a mass awakening and really just beautiful. That was John Paton. Last one I want to talk about here in the 3 minutes we've got left are Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor goes to China. He's a second-generation missionary. Hudson Taylor's big push was to go beyond the coast. By the time Hudson Taylor arrives in China, a lot has happened. The Opium War has happened. Chinese coastal cities are open to foreigners residing there. And there were missionaries in these coastal cities, and Hudson Taylor looked at them and said, guys, we're way too comfortable. We need to go into the inland where there is no knowledge of Christ. And to do that, we need to actually look less like Westerners and more like Chinese people, so they'll actually give us a hearing. So Hudson Taylor says, I'm going to stop dressing in suits, and I'm going to start dressing like a Chinese person. I'm going to cut my hair and dress like a Chinese man rather than a Westerner. He got all kinds of pushback for that, but he did it anyway. People were saying, no, stay in the coastal cities. He said, nope, I'm going to dress like a Chinaman and I'm going into the interior. And he organizes a group of people to go with him. 1865, he founds what was later known as the China Inland Mission. And within about 20 years, less than 20 years, CIM, China Inland Mission missionaries, had visited every province of the Chinese Empire and had about 650 missionaries working for them. Less than 100 years later, they were the largest missionary organization in the world. And even today, what's really interesting is they took the gospel out into all those hinterlands of China. And as the communists took over in 1950, all of the focus of Chinese culture is on the East Coast. That's where the cities are, that's where the power is. That's where Christianity was most persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. But as the Cultural Revolution abated and China begins to urbanize, so people are moving from the country into the city, a lot of those people from the hinterlands that are coming into the city were Christians. And their churches were originally established by the China Inland Mission. And so the mass urban Chinese Christian movement that you see today was largely seeded by the rural China Inland Mission efforts of 100 years prior. And again, if you look at the case of any of these people, we are out of time. None of these people were royalty. None of them were like blue bloods. They were just common people like us who said, I want to live for Jesus. It's better to burn out than to rust out. And they changed the world. Okay, I'll come to you in just a second, Joffrey. The last thing I want to say is, what are the three great principles of Protestant missions? The 3 Ps. You can remember them this way. Penetrate, propagate, perpetuate. The first step is you have to penetrate your host culture. You have to learn the language. You have to learn the way they think. You have to get established. All the missionaries did that. Hudson Taylor spent 7 years just to learn the Chinese language. It's hard, trust me. 7 years is not too long. Then the second stage is you do your ministry. You give your little part by God's grace to whatever the church and the gospel needs in that country. But then a key step for making sure the gospel goes forward is before they leave, they find a way to hand it off, either to other missionaries or ideally to native partners, native churches. Those 3 principles really guided all Protestant missions, and still to this day guide Protestant missions.